slideshow. All right, here we go. So like I said, chapter 22 is diseases of the nervous system. And just a little bit of a reminder from A&P1. So everybody here should have taken A&P1 because it's a prerequisite for microbiology. And in A&P1, you learn about the nervous system. So things like central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, somatic nerves, autonomic nerves. That should all sound familiar, I hope. Okay. Now remember, our class is microbiology, so there will not be any anatomy and physiology questions on our test. Okay. So oftentimes with these remaining units, I will give you some A&P type stuff, okay? Sometimes it's a little bit of just kind of a refresher, a reminder. When we do like digestive system diseases, if you haven't had A&P2 yet, you might not know anything about the digestive system. So you might need just a little bit of background information, but our test will not have any anatomy and physiology questions because that's not what our class is. Hopefully you remember what the meninges are. So the meninges are the protective membranes that surround the brain and the spinal cord. They're called the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. They're going to become important in a second here because we're going to talk about some very serious diseases that affect the meninges. And then hopefully learn about the blood-brain barrier, which is very important because the blood-brain barrier is what keeps a lot of potentially dangerous pathogens out of your brain. So nervous system diseases are often very rare because your body is going to do everything it can to protect your brain from becoming infected by bacteria and viruses and that kind of thing. And one way that it protects the brain is through the blood-brain barrier, where it keeps things that are in the blood, like toxins and poisons and bacteria and viruses, it keeps them out of the brain. It's very, very important. But what can happen is some of those things can actually affect the meninges because the meninges are that kind of, membrane that surrounds the brain itself. So it's kind of like right there up against the brain and it's protecting the brain. But, if the meninges are being, harmed or if they get infected by something, that's still going to affect the brain. It may not be infecting the brain itself, but the brain could still, be harmed in some way. So that's important to keep in mind. All right, so inflammation, especially inflammation of the meninges, can alter the blood-brain barrier. And another thing, the problem with the blood-brain barrier is that there are some pathogens that can actually get through it, but then the antibiotics that would help to fight that infection, those antibiotics can't actually cross the blood-brain barrier. So like the pathogen could get through, but then the medicine can't get through. So obviously, that's an issue, that's a problem. So sometimes what has to be done if somebody has a serious enough brain infection, doctors will put in what's called a shunt, which is essentially, like an IV, but they put it directly into the skull so that they can administer antibiotics directly into the brain instead of, putting it in an IV. Because if you put antibiotics in an IV, they're not going to be able to get through the blood-brain barrier and they're not going to be able to help the brain at all. So it's kind of pointless. So you maybe have heard the term meningitis before. Meningitis is inflammation of the meninges. So this is what I was talking about before. you may have a pathogen that is causing an infection in the meninges, so it's technically not in the brain itself, but it's still harming the brain, because if the meninges are inflamed and they have an infection, which is what meningitis is, it's still going to hurt the brain. And then encephalitis is actual inflammation of the brain itself. So if someone has an encephalitis disease, it's an actual, infection of the brain itself. And like I said, infections of the central nervous system are rare, but very serious. And of course, it's the brain. It's the most important organ in your body. So if the brain has some sort of problem, if it has some sort of infection or disease or inflammation going on, of course, that's going to be very serious. All right, so starting off here with some specific diseases, we are going to talk about different types of bacterial meningitis. So they all pretty much share the same basic types of symptoms, which are going to be a high fever, a headache, a stiff, painful neck. Then it progresses to nausea, vomiting, and then, if nothing is done, if they're not taken to the hospital, if nothing is done to help them, then they can slip into a coma and die. So the three most common types of bacterial meningitis are listed here. You have Haemophilus influenza. So notice that that is italicized. So this is a scientific name of a bacteria. So this is a bacterial species, okay? Now, notice that, the species name says influenza. Now, of course, we know that the disease, influenza or the flu, that is caused by a virus, okay? So when this bacteria was first discovered, the ones who discovered it thought that it was causing the flu. So they named it Haemophilus influenza. Haemophilus means blood loving. So hemo is blood and philus is loving. So they thought that this bacteria that they had discovered was actually causing influenza. So they named it that, and they were wrong. But the name just stayed the name. So don't let that confuse you, okay? So, when you see the name Haemophilus influenza, okay, don't think of the flu, okay? This is not the cause of the flu, okay? This is a type of bacteria that can cause meningitis, okay? So it's gram-negative. There's a vaccine available. It's one that's more common in very young children, and it can actually also cause pneumonia and ear infections. So this is something we talked about way back when we talked about Koch's postulates, right? This is one of the limitations of, those kind of quote unquote rules, is we have one specific type of bacteria and it's causing 3 different diseases. It's causing pneumonia, meningitis, and ear infection. But it's one bacteria, 3 different diseases, 3 different symptoms, okay? The next one is Neisseria meningitis. So this one, it has meningitis in the name. So that's helpful, right? Now, this is the one that's also known as meningococcal meningitis. This one is also gram-negative, and this is the one that tends to affect people who are in their late teens, early 20s, people who go away to college and live in dormitories, or people who go away in the military and live in military barracks. If they don't get vaccinated. Now, of course, if you join the military, you don't have a choice. You have to get vaccinated. You can't join the military and say, no, I'm not getting the vaccine, because then you'll just get kicked out. But it's an important vaccine to get, because if you're going to be living around all of these new people with all these new germs that you've never been around before, it's really important to get vaccinated for meningococcal meningitis, because it's just all these people of the same age kind of sharing germs with each other. And then finally, we have Streptococcus pneumoniae. This is also known as pneumococcal meningitis. Now, you may guess from the name that this is a very common cause of pneumonia. And this bacteria will actually cause pneumonia much, much more often than meningitis. Okay. Now, this one, since it's Streptococcus, it's gram-positive. So this is a good one for talking about the importance of gram staining, right? So if you suspect that a patient has meningitis, okay, one of the first things you're going to do is you're going to do what's called a lumbar puncture, or an LP. Sometimes it's called a spinal tap, but that's kind of like a very colloquial name for it. But basically, you have to collect cerebrospinal fluid from the lower vertebral column. And one of the tests that you do is you do the gram stain test, because that can tell you what type they have. Now, of course, a lot of times you kind of narrow it down. If they're 2 years old versus 18 years old versus 60 years old, then you can kind of sort of go off of that. But again, it's a good example of gram negative versus gram positive. It's good to know that information. Okay, so you definitely want to know these. All right, I will ask you questions on the test. Which ones are gram negative, which ones affect the younger kids, which ones are dangerous for the elderly, which one is pneumococcal, which one is meningococcal, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, you definitely want to know these for sure. Oh yeah, there we go. So there's the cerebrospinal fluid being taken, gram staining. I said all that, I just forgot to hit the button for the PowerPoint. All right, and now we have a fourth type of bacterial meningitis. Now this one, it's kind of on its own slide, because this one's a little bit more special. It's different, it's more unique, it's more rare. Okay, and this is called listeriosis. So it is gram positive. It is caused by Listeria monocytogenes. And like I said, it's kind of like that kind of other more unique form of meningitis. Yeah, it's just, you want to know that as well. It can occur in newborns. It's very dangerous if pregnant women get it, because it is a common cause of stillbirths. So very dangerous for pregnant women, for fetuses, and for newborns. So again, you want to be, learning these bacterial names, learning the names of the diseases, which ones are gram positive, which ones are gram negative, and then definitely if there's anything just kind of special, unique, any sort of like claim to fame as far as the diseases go, that's the type of stuff you want to be learning. At least, it's not a spelling test, it's not an oral exam. So, you don't have to spell Listeria monocytogenes, you don't have to be able to pronounce it, you just have to be able to just recognize it on the exam, and you should hopefully be good. I mean, a lot of times, at least you're seeing, sometimes the names kind of line up with the diseases a little bit, and hopefully that'll help a little bit as you're studying. Question in the chat box: are there gram-negative cocci? So I mean, I can't name one just boom off the top of my head, but the easy answer is with bacteria, pretty much anything is a possibility. Just like I said before, when we talked about like with endospores, we say, all right, well, gram positive can do endospores. Well, technically so can gram negative, but we just kind of leave it, let's try to keep it simple. So a lot of times we'll say like, yes, cocci tend to be gram positive, and then, bacilli or rods tend to be gram-negative because the classic examples, of course, staph are gram-positive cocci, and then E. coli are gram-negative rods. This one here is a gram-positive rod. So yeah, absolutely, you can have gram-negative cocci, with bacteria. I mean, the word diversity, it just goes hand in hand. So yeah, I mean, any kind of possibilities exist out there for sure. All right, so then for Listeria, it is also one that definitely can be linked to food poisoning. So the most common way that people get listeriosis is actually through contaminated food. And it will often cause more like in terms of like food poisoning type of symptoms, especially if it is a, quote unquote, normal, regular, healthy adult with a healthy immune system. The big concern again is when it's, a pregnant woman. So that's why when a woman is pregnant, one of the first things the doctor will do is give you this long list of foods where the doctor is like, do not eat any of this, So a lot of it is like any sort of like raw foods, different types of like pork products, just a big long list of stuff. And, Listeria is one of the main culprits. That's why that list is so long. Because you don't want to risk it. You don't want to, you don't want to take the chances. So yes, how would it be determined? I mean, there's all kinds of different tests, but yeah, you would definitely do anytime that meningitis is a suspect. You would definitely want to do the lumbar puncture for sure. All right, next. All right, so not only am I sure, I know that you've heard of tetanus before because we talked about tetanus already because of when we talked about endospores and vaccines, because it's both. Tetanus is caused by Clostridium tetani. The bacteria is a gram-positive endospore former, and it produces a neurotoxin. So the endospores is what makes it especially dangerous in terms of the spread of the disease. And then the neurotoxin is what makes it especially dangerous in terms of the actual infection. So the way that tetanus can get you is if you were to cut yourself on an old, jagged, rusty piece of metal or, garbage, debris, something that's been laying around, collecting dirt or dust or something like that. Because what happens is, the bacteria was hanging out on that surface. The surface became, dry, inhospitable. And the bacteria is like, well, I don't like living here. This is not a good place to live anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and form an endospore and I'm going to hang out here. Maybe I'll hang out here for 100 years. And then, once somebody comes along and cuts themselves, the bacteria, your blood, it has nutrients, it has water. It's a lovely, wonderful place for the bacteria. And spore basically kind of comes back to life, and that's when the problems start. So the bacteria is going to release the neurotoxin. The neurotoxin essentially is going to cause your muscles to spasm and basically kind of lock up on you. So your muscles will not be able to relax or stop contracting. Oftentimes the muscles of the jaw are going to be affected. So that's where the term lockjaw comes from. Now, the vaccine is very, very important. So, you know, if you work in construction, if you, you know, if you flip houses or remodel homes, or even, you know, like if you have an older house and you're cleaning things up or fixing things up or something, you know, make sure you're up to date on your tetanus vaccine. Now, the other thing is, you know, if you do cut yourself and you have to go get stitches, you know, most people are not going to just like stitch themselves up. You know, most people are going to go to a hospital, you know, and the hospital is going to, you know, I mean, if you refuse to get a tetanus vaccine, the hospital is going to do everything they can to convince you otherwise. And you're probably going to have to sign off on about 10 different pieces of paper. They're probably going to have, they'll probably get you to like swear, you know, on a recording, because I'm telling you, if you actually get tetanus, once the toxin begins to affect your nerve cells, it's pretty much fatal. I mean, once your muscles actually start to be affected by the tetanus toxin, you're going to die. I mean, that's just, you know, because the thing is, you have to remember your muscles control your heart, they control your breathing, and you're just going to die. You know, it's a terrible, horrible way to go. So you want to make sure that you're up to date on your tetanus vaccine. It's a very important vaccine. And then of course, you know, anytime you get a bad cut, you're going to need to go get stitches anyway. So you just get the vaccine. Like if you don't know if you're up to date on the booster, just you get the vaccine when you get your stitches and you're good to go. Now, kind of a close cousin in a way to tetanus is botulism. So botulism is caused by Clostridium botulinum. So botulism, interestingly enough, is a form of food poisoning. So you might be thinking, well, why are we talking about it if this is diseases of the nervous system and it's a type of food poisoning? Shouldn't that be in digestive system? Well, yes. The thing is, it's just one of those things where just classically, you always talk about tetanus and botulism together. Now, botulism can also cause paralysis. And in fact, that's what Botox is. So have you ever heard of Botox before? Botox is when people get like these little injections into the wrinkles of their face, and the wrinkles go away. The wrinkles go away because what's happening is the nerves in your skin of your face are being paralyzed by the botulism toxin. The other thing that Botox is used for is to prevent underarm sweat, because people will get the Botox injected into their sweat glands of their underarms, and it paralyzes the sweat glands. So it is a paralytic toxin. So it is still a nervous system disease. It's just the way that you get it is often from improperly preserved foods. And as a result, it can cause severe nausea and vomiting. So it is really more of a type of food poisoning, but it's still considered a nervous system disease. It's weird, but it's just kind of how it is. So if you've ever known anyone, or maybe you've even done this yourself, you try to make like your own kind of like jams and jellies at home, or you know someone who does this, right? So you get like the little mason jars, right? And then you you put the stuff in there and you seal them up, and you wait, a couple months or a few months or whatever. And then you're like, oh, okay, my marmalade in the basement is ready now. And, let me go ahead and get it. And, if that isn't done properly, that's how you can get botulism. So what happens is, if you do not properly sterilize the jar and the lid and pretty much every last single thing that you're using, okay, then you can get Clostridium botulinum in there. Clostridium botulinum is an anaerobe, okay? So oxygen will kill this bacteria. But if you seal the bacteria up in a jar or a can, right, you've removed the oxygen. So the bacteria is like, oh, hooray, the oxygen is gone. This is great because oxygen hurts me, right? So now you've got an oxygen-free environment in like a jar of like jam or jelly or honey or something, right? And the bacteria is like, oh, I'm just gonna eat this stuff and I'm just gonna live and it's gonna be great. And then while the bacteria is doing that, it's producing these different types of toxins, these different, neurotoxins and stuff, right? So then when you're like, well, time to eat this stuff that I made, right? And you open up the jar and you get the spoon or whatever in there, right? When you expose the bacteria to the oxygen, the bacteria gets killed. But the oxygen doesn't do anything to the toxins that are already in there. So the botulism toxins are already in there, right? So the bacteria might be killed by the oxygen that you've just introduced into the jar because you open the jar and, the air has oxygen in it. But the bacteria has already been in there for a few months making toxins, okay? Now, like I said earlier, if you are a regular, normal, healthy adult and you only eat a little bit of it, you'll probably be fine, okay? If you eat a lot of it, you'll probably be sick. You'll probably be throwing up and you'll have food poisoning and you'll be miserable for probably 24 to 48 hours, but you'll still be okay, all right? Now, if you eat the whole jar, you may have to go to the hospital overnight and get, an IV, all right? The problem is if you give that stuff to a baby or an elderly person or someone that has an especially weakened immune system, they could die. It's very dangerous, okay? Botulism is the reason why you should never give a baby, so someone under 1 year old, okay, never give them honey. Because honey is a natural environment for botulism to occur in very small amounts. So if you buy a little jar of honey at the grocery store, chances are there's a teeny tiny bit of botulism in there. Now, most people, when they use honey, they're only going to put a teeny tiny little bit in their tea or dessert or whatever they're using the honey for, right? You're not going to put, you're going to take the whole jar of honey and eat it in one sitting. I mean, most people don't do that. All right. But even a teaspoon of that honey can be very dangerous for an infant. So it's really important that, you don't want to give a young child, any sort of jam or jelly or preserves that somebody just kind of made, at home, a homemade kind of thing, If it's a jar of jelly from the grocery store, it's fine, because trust me, those companies are extra careful. Those jars are sterilized, okay? But then when it comes to honey, any sort of honey, it doesn't matter, even honey from the grocery store, you don't want to give that to anyone under 1 year old because it can make them very sick. All right, so that's botulism. All right, next is leprosy. So leprosy is, it's a weird disease. It's caused by Mycobacterium lepra, which is interesting because if you remember the name Mycobacterium tuberculosis is the bacteria that causes tuberculosis. So the bacteria that causes leprosy is kind of like a cousin to the bacteria that causes tuberculosis, which is weird because two very different diseases. Like you can't get much more different than those two diseases. It's also the only known bacteria that actually has the ability to infect the peripheral nerves, which is also weird. But if you've never heard of leprosy before, it's not really surprising. Now, leprosy, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, was very well known because it was thought to be a disease of the poor, a disease of the unclean, a disease of the unfortunate. It had a lot of social stigma attached to it. If you've ever heard of Mother Teresa, a very famous nun, she was known for going to, these quote unquote leper colonies, and she would pray with people and try to help counsel people, because essentially, what communities would do, if they found out you had leprosy, they would basically force you out of your house and tell you to go live with other people that had leprosy because they didn't want you to give it to them. So, very socially stigmatizing for sure. So the bacteria prefers the cooler parts of the body, so the fingers and toes and the hands and feet. Those are the coolest, parts of the body. It attacks the myelin sheath of the peripheral nerves. And there's two types. There's tuberculoid, where the people will lose feeling in their fingers and toes. And there's progressive, where the fingers and toes and often the hands and feet will become deformed and necrotic, which means that they will turn black and fall off. So it's possible for people with leprosy, they will have a stump where, their hand used to be because their hand essentially rotted and fell off. So somebody in the chat box is just sharing with me that when they traveled to another country, they actually visited a leper colony. So yeah, these things, certainly still exist. I've talked to you before about just, when you travel outside of the United States, it is a whole different kind of world completely when it comes to infectious diseases. Prior to COVID, what infectious diseases did we worry about in this country? I mean, the flu and HIV, maybe. I mean, even HIV, we were not really worrying about so much anymore. But, other parts of the world, parts of Africa, parts of South America, parts of Asia, major infectious diseases that they still worry about all the time. So, and leprosy, it's I wouldn't say it's at the top of the list. I mean, tuberculosis is still at the top of pretty much every list of every country, including the United States. You just don't, you don't see it, you don't hear about it unless you work at a hospital. So most of you, once you kind of get out there into your careers, you're going to see tuberculosis. It's still there, even in this country. I mean, there's only so much you can do about that one. But leprosy, I would say, is not going to be one that's at the top of the list. And definitely research into the link between tuberculosis and leprosy, just because the bacteria are similar. The bacteria themselves are related, which is weird because the diseases could really not be more different. Although there's certainly a similarity with their ability to escape phagocytosis. which will definitely be a topic once we get to talking about tuberculosis. That will be in respiratory system, of course. All right, now we're going to talk about the viruses. So the first one we're going to talk about is polio or poliomyelitis. So polio is a cause of paralysis. This disease was very, very well known in the early 1900s. So the 1910s up until about the 1940s. This is one where a lot of children contracted polio. The children whose families had a little bit more money, they would get wheelchairs. So you had, children who had to be, escorted around in wheelchairs and stuff. The families, and again, you're talking the time of, World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. I mean, all that stuff that's going on during these big, outbreaks of polio, where you had lots and lots of children, from 5 up until, 12, 13 years old. And then, of course, to adult age, but that, because once you got polio, once you became paralyzed, I mean, you were paralyzed for life. You didn't get better. But just the, I don't know how I want to put it. There's something to be said about a 5-year-old child who's paralyzed and can't walk versus, I guess, an adult. I don't want to sound mean, but there's something about a young child and seeing that, there were a lot of families who couldn't afford wheelchairs. They couldn't afford, crutches that they had to carry their children. That the children couldn't leave the house because they were paralyzed. That they couldn't walk. They were paralyzed from the waist down. That they were not able to walk. So the theory behind these big outbreaks of polio in the United States, it's an interesting one. So the theory is that it is due to improved sanitation. So not that things were getting worse, but things were getting better. Because what was happening in the very late 1800s and the very early 1900s in the United States, especially in the cities, is that we were finally starting to really clean up our act, right? So there was a time for, hundreds of years, especially in our country, where, people would just throw their garbage, in the street. Their waste, even like their fecal matter, their soiled linens, just throw it in the street, just throw it outside. Like, hey, I don't want this in my house anymore. Throw it outside my door. There wasn't trash collection. There wasn't sewage treatment. There wasn't all these things that we totally take for granted nowadays. Right. So it wasn't until after the Industrial Revolution, just a lot of it really had to do with the proving of the germ theory. Just a lot of things happened in the 1890s, the 1900s, the 1910s, the 1900s, however to put it. Prior to the start of World War I, and then kind of right after World War I in the 20s, a lot of things really kind of got going in the United States, just in terms of what I like to say, cleaning up our act, just kind of like, okay, let's not throw our trash in the street. Let's maybe, bag it up. Let's try to take it somewhere. Let's not like pollute our water sources. Let's try to like not have things be like, gross all the time, But what actually, what you know, epidemiologists and doctors, people who study this stuff, what they think happened is that children were not being exposed to weakened forms of the polio virus anymore. So the word for that is attenuated. So attenuated viruses. So basically, you know, and this theory carries over to nowadays. I mean, we don't have to get into the whole big story about it, but you know, basically, you know, when kids would quote unquote go out and play, you know, they weren't playing in filth anymore. That they weren't being exposed to, you know, I mean, I hate to say it, but like, you know, things that were contaminated by trash and garbage and fecal material and just human excrement and waste and just all that gross, disgusting stuff you don't want to think about, right? That wasn't around anymore. That literally, it was gone, right? So now the little tiny like bits of the virus that these children may have been exposed to in the environment through the air, through the water, through the soil, it wasn't there anymore. So they weren't developing any sort of innate or natural immunity to the polio virus. So the only way that they were contracting the virus is from other people, other children. And that was an active, infectious version of the virus. And that's why so many children in the 1910s, the 20s, the 30s, that's why so many of them got polio and became paralyzed. So then the advent of, you know, vaccines came about, and we were able to protect, you know, millions and millions of children from polio. And the last known case of polio in the United States was in 1979. So we very quickly were able to vaccinate basically an entire generation of people that fast. I mean, it's pretty good if you think about it. I mean, you think about in the 1940s and 50s, a lot of the kids who got polio were then adults, and then their children, you know, in the 40s and 50s started to get vaccinated. And by 1979, nobody in America had polio. And it was, I think, probably going on a couple years now, that the entire continent of Africa was declared polio free. So, you know, if a lot of the things in the world didn't happen in the last few years, because there's been not only COVID, but there's been a lot of political upheavals, there's been a lot of things going on. But it is the hope that, you know, hopefully in the next decade, polio will be like smallpox, which means it will be completely eradicated from the planet, so that no person will ever get polio ever again. That is the goal. So I would encourage you to, you can read about polio a little bit more in your book. You can do a little bit more research about the polio vaccine, because it's actually, I mean, I guess you could use the word ironic, it gets thrown around a lot, but the political controversies surrounding the development of the polio vaccine, a lot of it mirrors some of the controversies with the COVID vaccine. So just kind of being educated about these things for as long as I have been, when some of the things were coming out about the COVID vaccines, you know, and people were throwing their fits and everything, you know, I'd say, yeah, and, you know, it's the same thing that happened in the 50s with the polio vaccine. And then, you know, just, if you want to do some of your own research about it, it's a fascinating thing. But when it comes to the tests, when it comes to the questions, just make sure you know everything on the PowerPoint about polio, and you'll be good to go. Now, There will be a lot of questions about rabies on the test. Now, the thing about rabies is if you become a nurse, a doctor, a medical professional in the United States, you will probably never see a patient with rabies ever, okay? But it is very important to remember that that is not the case for the rest of the world, right? The way I was just talking about polio, I mean, polio is almost completely eradicated from the planet, okay? Rabies will never be, okay? And the reason for that is because rabies is a zoonotic disease. That means that rabies is a disease that humans and animals share and can give to each other, right? Polio is only a human disease. So it would almost be impossible to eradicate a zoonotic disease. But a disease where only humans can get it, you know, through vaccines, it certainly is possible. Now, in the United States, it is extremely rare for a human to get rabies. And we'll talk about all that stuff in a second here because I have another slide. But other parts of the world, that is not the case. So rabies, believe it or not, that is one of the diseases that, you know, if you travel to, you know, certain countries, you may actually want to think about getting vaccinated for rabies. And if you join the military, and if they, you know, if they send you to various other parts of the world, you may have to get vaccinated for rabies. But if you are wondering where the word rabies comes from, it is Latin for rage or madness. So that kind of tells you what the virus does to you. And then we have arboviruses or arthropod-borne encephalitis. So this is a group of diseases that are vectored by arthropods. Most of them are vectored by the mosquito. And then oftentimes birds will serve as reservoirs. So birds are not affected by these, but they can spread them. And some of these you may have heard of, some of these you may not have. So we have Eastern equine encephalitis, Western equine encephalitis, St. Louis disease or St. Louis encephalitis, California encephalitis, and West Nile encephalitis. West Nile is probably the one you've heard of. So all of those diseases are vectored by the mosquito. So what that means is the mosquito will carry the virus, and when it bites you, it will transmit the virus to you, and it can cause encephalitis or an infection of the brain, and it can be fatal. It can be deadly, depending on, you know, your health and depending on your access to treatment, to hospital. You know, look at some of these names, right? You have California, you have St. Louis. I mean, these diseases are absolutely diseases you can get in the United States. So mosquito control, preventing mosquitoes, very, very important, even in our country. I mean, we live in a part of the country where mosquitoes are very much a problem for, you know, maybe 1/3 of the year. Okay, I wouldn't say half the year, but definitely 1/3 of the year. So you want to do everything you can to keep the mosquito populations down and to keep them off of you. Because yes, they're a nuisance, but they can definitely spread some pretty bad diseases. All right, more about rabies. So not a lot of diseases, or at least I should say, not a lot of infectious diseases that we know of are 100% fatal. Rabies is, okay? Now, technically, rabies is like 99.996% fatal. That's pretty close to 100%, okay? Now, rabies does cause encephalitis, so it will cause inflammation and swelling of the brain, and that is how it kills you, okay? It is a RNA virus. The family name is Rhabdoviridae, and the genus name is Lissa virus. And I do know this one. There's very few of these little tidbits that I know, but being a vet tech and studying to, potentially, but obviously it didn't work out, but studying to be a veterinarian, you have to know a lot about rabies if you're going to work with animals. So I studied it quite a bit. Lissa virus actually comes from the name of, I want to say it was a Greek goddess named Lissa. And she was basically like the goddess of madness. And that's how it got the name Lissa virus. It's something like that. I may have gotten a couple little details mixed up, but it's something like that. I'm sure that most of you know how you get rabies. I'm going to assume, okay? You get rabies by being bitten by an animal that has rabies, right? I'm going to assume that most of you knew that. Now, the reason that rabies is almost unheard of in humans in the United States is because we vaccinate our pets. We vaccinate our dogs, cats, and even ferrets. So if you own a dog, a cat, or a ferret, you are required by law to vaccinate them for rabies. Every state in the United States has laws on the books that says you must vaccinate your animals for rabies. And if you don't, the state has the right to come to your home and take your animal away and euthanize it if you don't vaccinate your animal. And, I've heard a lot of stories, okay, from pet owners about why they don't need to get their animal a rabies shot. And I'm telling you, it's not going to work out. You have to get them their rabies shots. It's very, very important, okay? Because rabies is a horrific, terrible disease. It has a very long incubation period. It can take several months for you to actually get the classic rabies symptoms, okay? So the preliminary stages are going to resemble the, quote unquote, flu-like symptoms. So, fever, body aches, nausea, that kind of stuff, Then that's going to progress to muscle spasms, personality changes. You will become aggressive. You will become agitated, quick to anger. You will then start frothing at the mouth. Hydrophobia is an interesting one. So if literally fear of water, if someone offers you a drink of water, if someone has rabies, they may actually fly into a rage about that. The reason is because someone with rabies, okay, one place that the virus will actually multiply in and cause very bad inflammation are the salivary glands. That's why the virus is transmitted through the saliva, right? So if an animal with rabies bites you, that's how you get it, okay? Because the virus multiplies inside of the salivary glands, okay? That also leads to paralysis of the swallowing muscles. So what happens is someone who is in advanced stages of rabies, they will develop a fear of basically drowning or suffocating because their swallowing muscles have essentially become paralyzed. So the thought of even trying to drink water will terrify the person because they think that they're going to drown. So, you know, if you have a patient with rabies, don't offer them any water to drink. Okay, first of all, it's not going to do them any good. They're going to die anyway. And it could actually make them a lot worse. And it could actually cause them to become very, very agitated and angry and, you know, not good. And then, you know, what ends up happening is the person will become paralyzed and the either the breathing muscles or the heart muscle will become paralyzed, then the person will die. So you know, in the United States, what do we have to worry about? Well, the primary thing we have to worry about are bats, because most of the types of bats that we have in the United States have the potential to carry rabies. But bats are immune to rabies. So they carry rabies, but they don't get rabies. They don't get symptoms and they don't die of it. So they carry it, but they don't get sick. And that's the problem. So I just saw a big old bolt of lightning. So hopefully I don't lose power. Obviously, if I just suddenly disappear, you'll probably know what happened. But yeah, so you have to, you know, anytime that you encounter bats or if you have bats, you know, like in your shed or if they get up in your attic or something, you have to get someone to come, you know, take them away. Now, bats are very important to the environment because they actually, a lot of them kill mosquitoes. They will eat bugs, they eat mosquitoes. And mosquitoes kill way more people, you know, than bats do when it comes to diseases. So, you know, bats are important animals to their ecosystem, but they're also dangerous to us and to our pets. Now, if you get your pets vaccinated for rabies, and if they're bitten by a bat that's carrying rabies, they should be protected. That's the whole point of getting them the vaccine. Now, other animals like raccoons and skunks and foxes, they could also potentially carry rabies, but they will get the disease and they will die from the disease, just like anything else. So if you see any of these animals like hanging around, especially during the day, and they're acting real crazy, they're kind of walking around like they're drunk or lost or confused, okay, call animal control. Tell them that you think there might be a rabid, you know, raccoon or fox or even a dog or a cat. You want to be careful. And then anytime that you get bitten by, you know, a dog or a cat that you don't know if it's a stray animal, right? Probably a good idea to get the rabies treatments, which, you know, if you ever heard of it before, yes, it's needles that go through your belly button. Not pleasant, but way better than getting rabies. But you have to remember that, you know, there's lots of countries on the planet that don't have animal control. They don't have laws that dictate animals getting rabies shots. So you have to be careful when you travel outside of the United States. Do a little bit of research and make sure that you know what the status of rabies is for the different countries that you're going to. It's really important. All right, whoops. So here is some more information about rabies. So you can see in our area specifically, it's the raccoon, okay, that you gotta watch out for, okay. I mentioned skunk, fox, bats, you know, all that kind of stuff. You know, pretty much anything with canine teeth, okay. So rabies is not carried by rodents. A lot of people, you know, they don't know that or they don't realize that. Yeah, so anybody in kind of Newcastle County, we're all kind of having bad storms. So anybody that loses power or anything, you know, hang in there. And actually, I'm gonna mute myself in a second here. I just want to check and make sure everything in my backyard's all right, because it looks like it's pretty bad in my area. Yeah, so rats, mice, raccoons, not raccoons, sorry, rats, mice, squirrels, groundhogs, that's what I meant to say, not raccoons, groundhogs, they do not carry rabies. Now they can carry other diseases, other things, okay, but not rabies. So rodents, they don't carry rabies. All right, I'm gonna mute myself just 1 second. Let me just make sure that everything in my backyard is not blowing away. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. I mostly just wanted to check and make sure my turtle was okay, and I wanted to make sure that the door to my shed was closed, so everything is okay. But yeah, so far I'm all right. I'm still recording, so anybody who loses power or anything, you should still be able to access the recording. All right, so I'm going to keep on going here. So another form of meningitis that's actually caused by a fungus is Cryptococcus neoformans, or just often called Cryptococcus. And this one is especially dangerous for anyone with HIV or AIDS. And that one is, you know, lots of fungal diseases are especially dangerous for people with AIDS. And this is definitely one of them. So Cryptococcus meningitis, very dangerous for people with AIDS. And then we have, this one should definitely sound familiar because trypanosomes, that comes from lab 4. Okay, so trypanosomes are a protozoan that causes African sleeping sickness, and the vector is the tsetse fly. So you want to definitely know that one as well. And then we have another disease that is nearly 100% fatal, and that is amoebic meningoencephalitis, which is a form of encephalitis caused by a freshwater amoeba. So you get this one from swimming in fresh water, usually in tropical regions. And if you kind of like, you know, suck up any of the water through your nose, the amoeba that might be living in that water can actually get up into your brain through your nose. And that is very, very deadly. It's extremely rare, but very, very deadly. All right, and then we have prion diseases. So the classic one is bovine spongiform encephalopathy, otherwise known as mad cow disease. Somebody in the chat box is bringing up, I don't know about a lake in Iowa as far as amoebic meningoencephalitis. I mean, I guess it's possible if it was warm enough. If you can find a link to that or anything and email it to me, that would be very interesting. I definitely saw something in the news, probably maybe about a year ago or so, but I don't think it was the United States. I think it was an American, but they were in, you know, like another part of the world, and they had actually gotten a brain amoeba, you know, from water, and they had actually died from that. Yeah, if you could find a link to that story, yeah, definitely send it to me. But yeah, so prions, remember, was mentioned before. Prions are infectious proteins. So now we're even tinier than a virus. So not a lot is known about them. Not a lot is understood about them. You know, definitely a lot of research still going on. A lot is thought that they are more genetic than an actual infectious type thing. So, you know, still kind of being worked out. But, you know, other types of prion diseases, sheep scrapie, which is basically mad cow disease, but in sheep instead of in cows. And then we have Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is basically the same disease, but in humans. And then Kuru is also in humans, but it was from ritualistic cannibalism that was found in isolated tribes in New Guinea. So what was happening is people would die, and then, you know, like their friends and family, part of their like burial ritual, they would eat parts of the dead person's brain, and then that would obviously, they would get the disease, and then they would die, and it would continue. And the people studying it were trying to like explain it to these people, like, you know, you shouldn't do that. This is what's causing the problem. But then, you know, this is part of like, you know, their culture. You know, this is like what they've always done. So like trying to get them to not do it, you can imagine, you know, the issue there. All right. And then I just put in here because your book talks a little bit about chronic fatigue syndrome, which is idiopathic or has an unknown cause, could be linked to genetics, could be linked to viruses. So it's mentioned in the book. I don't think I have any questions about it on the test, but I just wanted to mention it here because it is mentioned in the textbook. And that is it for chapter 22. So let me go ahead and stop the recording.